You spend 30 years building something. You pour your sweat and your sanity, your soul into it. You think it's a legacy. You think it's family. Then, one Tuesday morning, you find out it was just a business, and you were just a line item on a spreadsheet about to be deleted by a kid who still uses his university email password for everything. The rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Omni Logistics Solutions headquarters, turning the Chicago skyline into a blurred watercolor of gray and steel. Hank Weaver, 58, watched it from his office, a space that smelled of old leather, stale coffee, and 3 decades of hard decisions. On his desk sat a model of the first cargo ship he ever secured for the company, a rust bucket that nearly sank in the Gulf of Mexico. He'd saved that ship, and in doing so, he'd saved Omni Logistics. He didn't hear the door open. "Hank, we need to talk." The voice was too high, trying too hard to sound like it belonged. Hank turned. Standing in his doorway was Cody Prescott, 29 years old, dressed in a suit that cost more than Hank's first car. His hair was a masterpiece of product and precision, his teeth unnaturally white. The CEO nameplate on the door outside had been his for exactly 47 hours. Behind him, hovering like a nervous sparrow, was Stacy from HR. She clutched a tablet to her chest as if it were a bulletproof vest. "Hank, Cody," Hank said, his voice a low rumble. "What can I do for you?" Cody didn't look at him. He was focused on his MacBook, propped open on the small conference table in Hank's office. He was still logged into his first Zoom call of the day, a virtual all-hands where he'd talked about synergizing disruptive paradigms. The CEO's son, day one in the big chair. Me, Hank Weaver, watching this kid who I'd taught to read a bill of lading try to end my career with a script. "We're terminating you. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." No handshake, no explanation, no thank you for 30 years of service, just the trembling HR rep standing behind him, looking like she was watching someone try to defuse a bomb with a butter knife. The ink on his promotion paperwork was still wet, and he was already playing executioner. Cody Prescott had his designer haircut, his Harvard MBA diploma freshly framed on the wall, and his disruptor confidence inflated like a balloon at a kid's party. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even blink. He just read the line off his tablet, word for word. You could tell someone had coached him, probably his father, or some expensive consultant, or the mirror in his corner office bathroom. Hank didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He stood up, the old leather of his chair sighing in relief. He adjusted the cuffs of his well-worn jacket, a uniform as familiar as the navy blues he'd worn decades before. He picked up his personal coffee mug, the one that read, "World's Okayest Uncle," and handed over his keycard and building badge with a calm that felt like armor. This was the kind of calm you learned after 30 years in global logistics and 6 years as a chief petty officer in the Navy before that. You learned to keep your head when storms were brewing, whether they were typhoons in the South China Sea or corporate hurricanes in a high-rise. Cody thought he was firing me. He thought this was his big move to streamline operations and modernize the legacy hierarchy. All I said was, "I'd think twice about this, Cody. You might want to call your father." I paused, letting the words hang in the air-conditioned silence. Tell him the board meeting in 3 hours should be very, very interesting. Then I walked out, past the silent HR rep, past the security guard, a guy named Marcus who I'd written a recommendation letter for when his daughter applied to college, who looked more confused than concerned. Past the framed photo in the lobby of the founding team from 1992. There I was, a young man with a thick head of hair and a determined stare, standing right next to J.D. Prescott, the ambitious visionary who'd talked me into leaving a stable job for this 3-man startup called Omni Logistics. The scene shifts. Hank is now in his car, driving through the rain. He speaks directly to the camera, a steely resolve in his eyes. "And hey, While I've got you here, if this already feels like the kind of corporate backstabbing that makes your blood boil, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Not because I'm desperate, I can assure you I am not, but because it really helps the channel keep digging up these stories, showing you what really happens behind those glass doors and in those corner offices. You'd be surprised how often the person getting fired is the one holding all the cards. Now, back to our regularly scheduled takedown. 3 hours. That's how long Junior had between his first firing and his first legal nightmare. In that time, I imagine he celebrated. Maybe he posted something on LinkedIn about making tough decisions for a digital future or streamlining operations for a new era. Hell, he probably had the hashtags ready. Hashtag next-gen leadership, innovation, future forward. Whatever buzzword his personal brand consultant had told him to use. Meanwhile, a digital packet had already landed in the inboxes of every board member, major investor, and the general counsel. It was sent from a private, secure server at 6:47 a.m., hours before my termination. The subject line was simple: Emergency Protocol Activation, Section 22A. Inside was a PDF titled plainly, Emergency Succession and Authority Reversion Protocol. It was buried in the original shareholder agreement, a document so old it still had dot matrix printer feed holes along the edges. It was a landmine nobody expected to step on. I'd written it. Our lead outside counsel, a brilliant and paranoid man named Walter Jones, had reviewed it, and every single investor who ever put money into Omni Logistics had signed it, thinking it was just boilerplate, a what-if scenario that would never, ever happen. But what happens if leadership goes completely off the rails? What if someone with a title but no stake tries to burn the house down? The answer in black and white was Section 22A. In the event a founding partner or principal shareholder holding more than 10% of company equity is terminated, demoted, or their authority is materially diminished by any appointed executive officer who holds less than 1% of company equity, and said action is taken without a formal pre-approved vote of the board of directors, then all interim executive authority shall be immediately suspended. It went on. The board shall be required to convene an emergency session within 4 hours of protocol activation. All voting power on matters of executive appointment and termination shall immediately revert to the majority shareholder until the emergency session is adjourned. Unlike Cody's termination memo, mine came with digital certified receipts, timestamps, and a full audit trail. He thought I'd go quietly. What he didn't know was that I never built my position at this company to be visible. I built it to be bulletproof against people exactly like him. Entitled, impatient, handed authority like it came with the family name. There's a reason my ownership percentage didn't appear in the glossy company brochures or on the leadership page of our website. I was the foundation under the building, the backup generator. The guy you called when the lawyers were circling, or when a competitor was trying to poach our biggest client, or when a port strike threatened to paralyze the entire East Coast supply chain. I never wanted the spotlight. I wanted security, stability, and equity. God, the equity. While they were naming conference rooms after the founder's grandchildren and giving out crystal plaques to VPs who'd been here 18 months, I was taking my payment in percentages. Half a point here, a full point there. Stock options instead of bonuses. Voting shares instead of fancy titles. It started back when Omni Logistics was 3 folding tables in a rented warehouse, a whiteboard that never erased properly, and J.D. Prescott, a man who thought compliance was something you could handle with a handshake and a smile. He was a visionary, sure, the kind who could see the future of integrated supply chain management, but couldn't remember if we'd paid the quarterly taxes or had accidentally double-ordered $6 million worth of shipping containers. I stepped in, I organized the chaos, I stabilized our operations, secured our lines of credit, and wrote the contracts that kept us from being sued into oblivion. For my trouble, after we landed the Trans Global account, Senior offered me a fancy VP title and a corner office with a view. I declined. You'd rather own the foundation than sit in the penthouse, he joked, clapping me on the back. Exactly, I'd said. By year 7, I was sitting on 19%. By year 12, it was 32%. When our first CFO left in a screaming match over budget allocations for his new department, I picked up his 12% stake at a steep discount. He needed cash fast. Divorce lawyers, as he discovered, don't work for free. When JD's brother, a charming scoundrel named Dennis, tried to sue the company for a phantom patent infringement and failed spectacularly, he wanted to settle privately to avoid the embarrassment. I took his remaining 18% stake in exchange for a bulletproof NDA and his promise to never contact our clients again. Piece by piece, contract by contract, I built my fortress. 58%. That's where I landed. Quietly. No fanfare, no press releases, just majority ownership, filed properly with Delaware's Secretary of State. Nestled inside that ownership was Section 22A, a clause nobody bothered to read because we'd never needed it. I wrote it after JD's nephew, a charming scoundrel named Trevor, tried to fire half our warehouse staff during a budget tantrum 15 years ago. That was the last time anyone touched authority they hadn't earned. Until today. Because what Cody Prescott didn't understand, what they don't teach you in business school, is that inheriting a title doesn't mean inheriting control. Control isn't gifted. It's not on your business card or your office nameplate. It's in the contracts, in the fine print, in the protocols written during late-night calls with paranoid investors who wanted to know what would happen if someone's unqualified kid got promoted beyond their competence. It turns out, it activates exactly like this. One arrogant termination, no board vote, no cause, no process. Just a 29-year-old with fresh veneers and a new email signature strutting into my office like he was directing a corporate takeover movie. He had no clue that by reading that script, he'd triggered a legal trapdoor that had been waiting 15 years for someone stupid enough to step on it. Now, Section 22A was live. I didn't just send the activation notice, I sent a complete legal package. Shareholder statements, equity breakdowns, archived email approvals, timestamp documentation, notarized copies of every single transaction. I even included his termination memo with its grammatical errors and Stacy's shaky digital signature. They'd be talking about that one for years. Because while he was probably figuring out how to access the executive parking garage and get his security clearance upgraded, the board was reading a memo titled Immediate Suspension of Executive Authority, Section 22A, Protocol Enacted. He was about to learn what real authority looked like, and J.D. Prescott had no idea his legacy heir had just stepped on a landmine with the family name engraved on the trigger. Somewhere, on the 12th floor, in a glass-walled office he didn't earn and didn't understand, Cody Prescott was, in fact, celebrating. He'd kicked back in the $1,000 leather chair, propped his expensive leather shoes on the desk that had once been his father's, and opened his laptop. He felt a surge of power. This was it. This was leadership, making the tough calls, cutting out the dead wood. The old guard was gone. It was his time. He started drafting a company-wide email. Team, as we embark on this exciting new chapter of digital transformation, it is imperative that we streamline our operations and embrace a culture of agile, forward-thinking leadership. He paused, sipping a kale and spirulina smoothie his nutritionist had prepared. He added a line. Leadership requires making tough calls for long-term vision. He smiled. It was perfect. He was perfect. He was completely unaware he was about to lose both leadership and vision. Meanwhile, across the city and in 2 time zones, board members were canceling lunch meetings, skipping golf tournaments, and calling their assistants in a panic. Walter Jones, the general counsel, was the first to grasp the full magnitude. He'd been in a deposition when his phone started buzzing incessantly. He finally excused himself, opened his tablet, and accessed the secure portal. His face, usually an unreadable mask of legal composure, went pale. He skimmed the clause.
his eyes darting to the key phrase, suspension of executive authority upon unilateral termination by non-equity appointee. He actually said out loud, to the empty hallway, "Oh no." Then again, quieter, "Oh, you stupid, stupid boy." The packet also included a meeting mandate. The board was legally required to convene within 4 hours. That timer had started ticking the moment my package was delivered. I'd made sure of that. I didn't need to be in the building. The law was there. The contracts were there. The documentation was airtight. By the time Cody's celebratory Instagram story hit, a boomerang of his smoothie glass clinking against his laptop with the caption, "First move made. Time to modernize. #CEO, #disruptor." His name was already flagged in the corporate governance software as the sole initiator of a termination he had no authority to make. The board members weren't happy. They were crapped. Because once Section 22A activates, it's not about office politics anymore. It's about fiduciary duty, voting rights, SEC compliance, personal liability. Their names were on filings they hadn't reviewed in a decade. This wasn't a family spat. This was a legally binding reversion of corporate control. And there, in black and white, was the number they hadn't thought about in years. 58%. Majority shareholder. Voting control. Emergency recall of all executive appointments made in the previous 48 hours. The best part? The clause wasn't just enforceable. It was irreversible once filed. That detail had been added during an investor scare a decade ago. They wanted assurance that if someone went rogue, they couldn't undo the emergency meeting with a panicked apology and a retracted memo. There was no Control-Z for this. So while Cody strutted through headquarters trying to figure out how to access the financial dashboards, boardroom chairs were already being arranged.
J.D. Prescott was on the 9th green at the Oak Meadows Country Club when his phone buzzed for the 6th time. The first 5 calls from the office he'd ignored. Golf was sacred. But the 6th ring was from Walter Jones' direct line. He answered with a grunt, his cigar still clenched between his teeth. "Walter, this better be urgent." "J.D., you need to get to headquarters now." Walter's voice was strained, stripped of all its usual legal pleasantries. "What's the problem? Can it wait? I'm 2 strokes up on Henderson." "Your son signed something this morning. We have a situation, a Section 22A situation." The blood drained from J.D.'s face so fast he felt lightheaded. 22A? That's the emergency succession protocol. Yes, the one Hank Weaver wrote. It's been activated. You have 2 hours and 17 minutes before the mandatory board meeting. J.D. didn't finish his round. He didn't say goodbye. He threw his clubs in the trunk of his Mercedes and sped downtown, still wearing his golf cleats and a bright green polo shirt. When he arrived, the legal and finance teams were waiting in the lobby. The air was thick with a palpable dread. They ushered him into the main conference room. Walter Jones didn't waste time. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a printed copy of my packet, and read in a flat, professional tone that made the words even more devastating. Per Section 22A of the amended shareholder agreement, any executive termination carried out by a non-equity appointee without prior board vote shall result in immediate revocation of all interim leadership authority and automatic reversion of executive control to the majority shareholder pending emergency review. J.D. went completely still. He stared at Walter as if the words were in a foreign language. Then his face tightened with dawning horror. "Who," he asked, his voice dangerously low, "authorized the termination of Hank Weaver?" The room was silent.
The CFO, a pragmatic woman named Brenda Shaw, looked at her hands. The head of operations, David Chen, studied the grain of the conference table. Who the hell signed off on firing Hank? JD's voice rose to a shout, echoing in the soundproofed room. Finally, Walter responded, his voice flat and unforgiving. Your son, alone, without board consultation or shareholder approval. He doesn't have sign-off authority for partner-level terminations, he sputtered, as if saying it could rewind the clock. No, he confirmed, adjusting his glasses. He doesn't. He was appointed CEO by board resolution, but he holds zero equity. His authority is entirely derivative, which means under Section 22A, his unilateral termination of a founding partner and principal shareholder is invalid and triggers immediate succession protocol. JD ran both hands through his silver hair, pacing now. This is a misunderstanding. I'll talk to him. We'll retract the termination. We'll say it was a prank, a miscommunication. There is no retracting this, JD, Walter said, his voice final. The protocol is active. Paperwork was filed before the termination was even executed, time-stamped, notarized, and distributed. You are out of time. But he's my son, JD's voice broke slightly. And right now, Walter cut him off, he's sitting in the executive suite planning a company restructure he has no legal authority to implement. He is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost in the machine. A very loud, very expensive ghost. JD sat down hard, as if the bones in his legs had turned to dust. He was no longer the confident founder of a $500 million logistics empire. He was just an aging businessman who realized he'd handed a live grenade to someone who thought the pin was a pull tab for a prize. What happens now? He whispered, mostly to himself. Walter Jones closed his briefcase with a definitive click. You sit in that boardroom, you listen, you do not interrupt. And when Hank Weaver walks in, because he will walk in, you remember that he controls 58% of this company and has every legal right to restructure leadership as he sees fit. JD looked up, his eyes wide with a fear I hadn't seen in 30 years. God help us all, he murmured, mostly to himself. At exactly 2:58 p.m., I walked back into the Omni Logistics Solutions headquarters. Same marble lobby, same company timeline etched in the wall, but everything had changed.
Marcus, the security guard, nodded respectfully and held the elevator door open. Conference room A, Mr. Weaver. They're all waiting for you. The elevator ride to the 12th floor was silent. The doors opened onto a hushed executive floor. I walked past Cody's corner office. The door was open, and I could see him inside, frantically making phone calls, his face flushed. He was probably calling his Harvard buddies, asking how to pivot out of a hostile takeover he didn't even know he'd started. I didn't pause. I walked to the double doors of the main boardroom and opened them at exactly 3 p.m. Every board member was there. 8 faces, some pale, some resigned, all of them understanding they were about to witness a corporate execution that would be studied in business law classes for years to come. J.D. Prescott sat at the far end, looking like he'd aged a decade in the last 3 hours. His golf shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. I didn't pause immediately. I placed my worn leather briefcase on the table. It was the same one I'd carried since my first day at Omni Logistics. I opened it with a calm precision and placed a single document on the polished mahogany. I spoke clearly, my voice filling the silent room. As majority shareholder of Omni Logistics Solutions, I hereby formally request a binding vote to rescind all executive appointments made in the previous 48 hours, pending a comprehensive shareholder review of leadership competency. The words landed like a judge's gavel. No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC system. Harold Weinstein, the board chair and our lead investor, cleared his throat. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Motion received and logged. Emergency session is now in order under Section 22A. I finally sat down. Not in a guest chair, not in a secondary seat. I sat in the chair at the head of the table. My chair. The one I'd earned over 30 years of keeping this company profitable and secure, while others played with org charts and mission statements. A nameplate had already been placed in front of it. It read, Hank Weaver, Chairman and Majority Shareholder. Someone in the admin pool was very, very fast. The door burst open 5 minutes later. Cody stood there, his face a mask of confusion and outrage. What is going on? Why wasn't I informed about this meeting? I'm the CEO. I looked at him directly, for the first time all day. Really looked at him. This kid I'd taught how to negotiate with stevedores in Singapore. This kid who'd called me Uncle Hank until he got his MBA, because suddenly I was part of the legacy overhead. You don't have the authority to call emergency board meetings. You never did. That's when it hit him. The termination he'd been so proud of, the power move he thought would define his leadership legacy, had triggered the one thing that could remove him completely. He'd fired the majority shareholder of his own company. The color drained from his face. But I'm the CEO. The board appointed me. He stammered, looking around the room for support that wasn't coming. Harold Weinstein spoke up, his voice gentle but firm. Cody, your appointment was conditional and derivative. You hold no equity stake, which means, under our corporate bylaws, specifically Section 22A, your unilateral termination of a founding partner and principal shareholder has triggered this review. This is ridiculous. Cody's voice pitched higher. Hank, you can't seriously want to destroy everything my father built over a personal slight. I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. Your father didn't build this alone, Cody. He built it with partners. I'm one of those partners. And partners don't get fired by their junior employees. The vote was called. All in favor of rescinding Cody Prescott's appointment as Chief Executive Officer, please raise your hand. One by one, hands went up around the table. Brenda Shaw, David Chen, the representatives from the venture capital firms. It was a slow, grim wave of inevitability. All eyes fell on J.D. Prescott. He was staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists. The weight of 30 years, of a legacy he'd hoped to pass on, was crushing him. He looked at his son, who was staring at him, pleading with his eyes.
Then, with a shuddering breath, J.D. slowly raised his hand. 8 votes. Unanimous. Cody looked like he'd been physically slapped. Dad! J.D. couldn't meet his son's eyes. I'm sorry, son, he whispered, his voice cracking. But this is bigger than family. This is about the company. About everyone who works here. The motion passes, Harold announced, his voice heavy. Cody Prescott's appointment as Chief Executive Officer is hereby rescinded, effective immediately. Cody stood there for another 30 seconds, a statue of entitled disbelief. When nobody moved, when no one came to his defense, the reality finally penetrated. He turned without a word and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final thud. At the threshold, he'd stopped and looked back at me. This isn't over, he said, trying to sound threatening. Yes, I replied, my voice quiet but absolute. It is. And it was. By 4:30 p.m., I was back in my office. Not a new office, not a consolation prize, but my office. The one with the scuff mark on the floor from the old filing cabinet, the one with the view of the railway lines that fed into the freight yards, a view I'd always loved. The model of the old cargo ship was back on my desk. Cody was escorted out of the building the same way I had been, except his exit was permanent. No 3-hour turnaround. No secret protocols. Just security walking him to his Audi, which he'd parked in the reserved for CEO spot that morning. The irony was a perfect, beautiful circle. J.D. Prescott stayed on as president of global operations, reporting to me. We had a private conversation in my office afterwards. The bluster was gone, replaced with the weary humility. "I let family cloud my business judgment, Hank," he admitted, staring out the window at the city he had helped me conquer. "I wanted so badly for him to be you. He wasn't ready. Maybe he never would have been. This company was your dream, JD. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even your son, drive it into the ground out of ignorance." He nodded, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were partners again. The next morning, there was no dramatic announcement, no company-wide email about a regime change, no speeches about a new direction. The Omni Logistics website was quietly updated. The driver schedules went out on time. The cargo ships were loaded. The clients were called. The only thing that changed was that the decisions were now being made by someone with 30 years of logistics experience and a majority stake in the outcome, instead of someone with 30 days of MBA theory and a sense of entitlement. A month later, I instituted the Omni Stability Fund, using a portion of my dividends to create an emergency financial safety net for all warehouse and logistics employees. No more layoffs during the first sign of an economic dip. Their jobs were secure. Their loyalty was earned. Sometimes power isn't loud or flashy. It's patient, it's strategic, it's built, brick by brick, in conference rooms and in contract law. In the quiet acquisition of responsibility, it's impossible to fire. Sometimes the person you underestimate, the one you think is just part of the furniture, is the person who poured the foundation and set every stone in the path you're walking on. And sometimes, when entitled arrogance finally crashes into earned authority, justice isn't an explosion. It's a quiet, legal, permanent correction. It's the sound of the right person taking the chair at the head of the table, and business, finally, going on, as it should. So, the next time you see some fresh-faced MBA try to make a name for themselves by pushing out the old guard, just remember, the old guard might not just be guarding a corner office. They might be guarding the very deeds to the kingdom. Subscribe if you want more stories from behind the corporate curtain. Trust me, this kind of thing happens more often than you think.